I'm just doing some feathery stuff on this phoenix bird. Had a few people asking about how I do painting on these feathers. So I thought I'd let you guys watch over my shoulder as I do this. What I'm starting with is let's see, this is a Daniel Smith ultramarine turquoise is the color that I'm using in my underlayer on these feathers along the neck of this bird. And I am using a size 0 Winsor Newton Series 7 Kolinsky sable. Slowly brushing in this underlayer along the feathers. And I'm making my strokes go along with the filaments of the feather, of each of the feathers. Now I only do this in areas where I want to have distinct feathers, not if the area is more smooth and you're just going to show more of the general coloration rather than individual little bits. And since my phoenix here has some rather large plumage along the neck and face area, that's why I'm doing this. And you see also I'm keeping my blues right now along the inner edges of these feathers, so it's more like the shaded portion of it, I guess. You see how I leave the white unpainted paper along the rim of each. Let me show you on another page what I'm talking about. So each of these feathers, well, let me draw first. Let me show you. They're sort of like scales, are how I have it on this particular bird. This is a fantasy bird, right? This might not necessarily be how it is on a real bird, but essentially I'm doing this sort of a scale texture, something like that. And then I elaborate on them. This is still even in the sketch phase. What I did was, rather than having these very solid edges, I make them more of a feathered edge. Imagine that on feathers, right? And I do that by breaking up the outer edges with these short strokes. Now I'm doing this in pencil right now, but essentially this is going to be what happens as I paint too. And for each feather, each of these, as I start to paint, so for example, here's blown up a little bit. If this is what I'm starting with for a single feather, as I paint it, what I'm doing right now with my ultramarine turquoise is I'm painting like this. I'm doing these kind of strokes, moving out from the center area, because the filaments of the feather actually go in this sort of outward motion from there, and you want to imitate that in your strokes when you're doing fine detail like this, because it's going to show and be apparent. So as I do this, this is what I start with my blue, and then later what I'm going to do next after this stage is I'm going to brush a wash of a secondary color over. This is sort of my underlayer. And what I like to do with feathers in particular, because there's a lot of iridescence that happens with bird feathers, what's fun is to use complementary colors. By complementary, I mean colors that are across from each other in a color wheel. Now this isn't exactly a color wheel, but generally the complementary color of blue is going to be orange. If it was a color wheel, I'd have orange on this side, but I'm That's probably confusing to you guys right now, but let's move away from that. But I'm going to be layering an orange glaze on top of this eventually as I finish with my underlayer. And sometimes I work in patches. I'll do this area and then I'll move on to another area, finishing off each successive area before moving on to the next. And sometimes I'll just go through and do the underlayers of everything all at once. But right now, for the sake of this video, I'm just going to do this small section because essentially I do the same thing repeated across the entire body. Okay, so now that I have a basic underlayer of my blues, I'm going to take next, what color do I want? I really like gamboge mixed with quinacridone sienna. The gamboge is Winsor & Newton one that I've got here. It's a really bright, intense, warm yellow. For cool yellows, I use the nickel titanium yellow. And by warmer, I mean this has more of an orange tint to it, and then a step beyond that would be quinacridone gold, which I also use sometimes when I want it to be even more of that warmness. But gamboge is great because it's transparent and it really brightens warm colors when you layer them on top, but it also makes interesting tones when you layer them on it on cooler colors, which is what I'm going to do at this point. I'm layering it on top of my blues. Sometimes I layer it on top of my red tones, and it really makes those red tones pop. Okay, so for now though, I've got these two, and I'm going to switch to a slightly larger brush because now I'm going to do a light wash. So this is diluted a little bit. And I'm just painting directly over. I don't want to move my brush and scrub it around too much over my paper, because by doing that you would end up lifting a lot of the previous layer, and I don't want to lift it. I just want to add this glaze on top of everything, this glaze of color. And by keeping my brush light on it, it will not disturb the previous layers too much. You can see this is it's not very dark, but it's not super light either. It's sort of a mid-tone wash. Oops, got a little bit of water dripped there. See, this is why I keep my little tray over here so I don't drip over everything, because I am very messy that way and prone to dripping water trails across a painting. I've had pieces where, before I started doing this, when I had my water way off to the side, I would have a little trail of drops going back and forth from every time I went to get more liquid. Fortunately, I figured out a method to avoid that. Next, I'm going to use quinacridone coral. This is one of my favorites for a really bright, pale, reddish tone. And now that my glaze is dry, I'm actually going to go back and do some more shading stuff that's very similar. Actually, I'm going to mix a little bit of my gamboge into my coral. I like how that turns it into more of an orangey tone. I want that more than the reddish pink. Okay, what I was saying though is that I'm going back and I'm doing these strokes that are actually very similar to what I did in my initial underlayer. And I'm doing it right on top. This layering gives you a complexity of colors because you still get little bits of that first blue layer showing through, and then on top of it I've got now this much more overt reddish tone. And this layering of complementary colors on top of each other and adjacent directly to each other really gives you that sense of iridescence that birds' feathers have sometimes. And in fact, that's sort of what your eye sees when you're looking at iridescence, because you're looking at light hitting the filaments of the feather from different angles, and the effect then is to create these complementary tones adjacent, just like I'm recreating with this painting. When I'm painting black feathers, I love to use greens and purples as my underlayers. And when doing white feathers, then you have to go and use a whole array of colors. It's a little bit like when I was painting a pearl. I have another video tutorial walkthrough of painting pearls, and you can see in that one all the different colors that really make up the white tones of a pearl. I'm not going to be painting this reddish orange on every feather. I'm actually going to leave these other ones further down the neck more blue dominant, because I like how the color shifts there. I'm enjoying how it goes up into these golden and red tones further up towards the head, and then shifts down into a much more cool and blue toned area down below. You can see I'm also just using the tip of my brush to do these little filaments and leaving space for the underlayers to show through my strokes. So I'm not making solid blocks of color, but rather I'm doing these short brush strokes that are sort of parallel to each other and radiating out from the center of each feather. Now I'm going to add a little bit of these darker reddish orange tones in the inner parts of these lower feathers, but I'm not getting rid of the blue on the edges entirely. This is just to add a little hint of darker color there. And then I go back and I do a wash again. This time I'm doing a wash of a diluted version of the same colors that I have just been painting with. And again, I'm not covering everything with my wash. By leaving areas where you don't layer successive washes, you start building up these variations of color tone, because some places will have one wash and other places will have another wash, and some will have none at all. So you end up with a lot of variety and complexity to your color tones. You see, I'm leaving, especially right now, this section right over here as mostly the white of my paper showing through. That's why this right here is so bright, because I mean this little U-shaped bit and this and this and a little bit over here and here and here. You can see those are the areas where my paper is showing through, while others have been layered over with many washes and the bits of dry brush that I'm doing. And so as I go successively through alternating with little dry brush details and washes over the top, you end up having something that is beautifully complex in its colors and all the layers that you build up into it. That's essentially how I do these kinds of feathery bits.